Ruslan.
The news came out, officially leaked through a Patreon exclusive podcast. Shout out to all our Patreon, by the way, of Joe Budden from the Joe Budden podcast firing Rory and Mal. Now, if you aren't keeping up with the podcast, I'll give you guys the cliff notes. Basically, Joe Budden has a super dope podcast. They've been going for years. Initially, it was called something like I'll Name This Podcast Later. His co-hosts were Rory and Mal. Long story short, they had an exclusive deal at Spotify. They left that. Joe has a partnership with Patreon. He has some equity in Patreon. And he was on Everyday Struggle with academics. Long story short, there was some tension. Rory and Mal disappeared for a month to come back for a few weeks and now officially get fired, only to find out that it was over business stuff. Now, specifically business stuff like they didn't have no equity in the podcast. They didn't know how much it generated. They didn't really understand the business side of it. People are calling Joe a scumbag because he's saying, hey, the same reasons you left Complex and you left Spotify, well, Rory and Mal are asking for the same questions. It's not really fair. So I'm gonna play you guys a clip here in a second, but I just wanted to catch everybody up on what is going on. Now, people are saying Joe Budden lost his podcast. Well, he did a couple of months with, I think a month without them. Podcast was fine. Had some of his biggest interviews. He had Kevin Samuels on. It goes back to the idea of worth, value, ownership, so on and so forth. The podcaster leak, DJ Academics responded to it. A lot of it also has to do with Joe staying connected with academics. Rory and Mal didn't like that. They had beef with academics. Whole bunch of nonsense behind the scenes, but it really sounds like it came down to the business side of things. Rory and Mal not having ownership, not knowing how much money was coming in, not having access to the YouTube money, not knowing what Patreon was coming in, trying to audit all these different things. And Joe's position was quite simply, listen, I own this, you guys are employees. I built this, I did the deals, I structured everything, you guys are employees. Now, I've been in situations where I have to work with other artists or other artists assigned to me, or I have group collaborations, and it's not fun because you're dependent on another person. But there's something that Joe Budden said that I wanted to highlight and dispel. And I don't think it's helpful. So I'm gonna play this and then I'm gonna give you guys where I think he's wrong. Sorry, I gotta play this from WorldStar. I couldn't find this clip anywhere else. WorldStar is like one of the most wild websites, but listen to this clip at 150. Check this out.
Oh, Rory and Mal can go start a podcast. Well, no, they can't. Not at least for another year.
By the way, forgive me if there's some profanity in this.
Had your kids, had your wife.
Explicit.
You've been warned. Okay, so he says Rory and Mal can go start a podcast. No, they can't. They gotta wait a year. So he put that in their clause. This is common. When someone has a platform, they put you on, they build you an audience or help build you an audience through their platform. They can put these sunset clauses in there, okay? I know Dave Ramsey has do not compete clauses. A lot of times Dave Ramsey owns the URLs of people's domain. Kind of wild if you ask me. And this is the difference of building something from the ground up, like you guys are watching me doing, and going and working on somebody who already has a platform. Joe already had the platform. Joe already had an audience as a rapper. He already had the leverage. These were his homies, but they didn't have the ownership. And he's kind of revealing some of the deals in the contracts.
By contract. If they do, I'm going to sue the pants off of them.
If they do, I'm going to sue the pants off of them. Yikes.
But whenever they're able to, they can go and start a podcast. They can pay for the staffing. They can source the advertising. They can source the integrations. They can pay the insurance.
Studio time.
They could pay for the studio time,
Engineer.
set, location, engineer. They could pay for the LLC formation. They
Furniture.
could pay for the insurance. They could pay what it costs to go on tour. You could pay what it costs for the hours of lawyer work for deals that don't get done. You can go do all of those things, but not here.
They don't got to do none of that, Joe. That's old head energy. You don't need to go rent a studio to go have a podcast. You don't need to get a daggone engineer to go do a podcast. You don't need to source the podcast material on all the platforms. You don't got to do none of that anymore. You know how I know? Because I stream on YouTube all the time, take the audio and throw it on the podcast app, and it takes me virtually no time. I don't want to keep up with the podcast app the way I should. But it is not that complicated. But what he's basically saying is like, I funded this thing, I own it, therefore I get to call the shots, I'm the boss. It's really sucky to be in a situation where you're kind of leasing your job, you're leasing your influence. Now, what's the point? What's the big idea? Big idea is build it right the first time. Build your life right the first time. Don't be in situations where you have this codependency collaboration with people because you're lonely or because you don't have the wherewithal to build it yourself. Build it right the first time. Second of all, they don't gotta do any of this. And this is why I want to gift Rory and Mal my course, because they can start a YouTube channel because they're already popping. It technically not be a podcast and just stream on YouTube every day and do what they were doing with Joe, without Joe. And it may not be as successful, but they'll be fine. Don't put it on a podcast app for a full year. Doesn't mean they can't stream on YouTube. And to stream on YouTube, as you'll see for my channel, the setup I built, there'll be a premiere of my entire studio coming this week. You don't need an engineer. You don't need to go rent a studio. This is like record labels trying to sell you on this whole, like, you gotta go to our studio. And their studio, of course, is $1,500 a day. So you're sitting there racking up all this debt, paying $1,500 a day for the studio. You can do that from the crib. And now with technology, you can. My advice to Rory and Mal, get on YouTube. Get on Twitch. You can't do audio only podcasts, fine. Don't do them. You get popping on YouTube and Twitch and be fine. And off the AdSense alone, not counting if they started a Patreon, they'll do fine without an engineer, without a producer, without a fancy studio. I'm talking $5,000 setup. They got that, or they should have that. And it comes back to the idea I talked earlier with regards to what Dave Chappelle and Joe Rogan said, having some money squirreled away, taking a chance on yourself because you've mitigated your overhead and you have some margin built in. So my advice to anybody looking to get into this space is don't listen to the Joe Buddens who built a podcast 5 years ago. Yeah, maybe you needed all that 5 years ago. You don't need that right now. You don't need that right now. You can find a corner of your house. You could build a cool little set. You could get a couple Mac Minis and you could build it on your own and just make the investment in the scarce skills. Learn the technology. We've gotten so far away from being curious, right? Jesus talks about this childlike faith. Be like a child. Be curious. Become like one of these. What is he talking about? What's the beautiful part about children? They're curious. They'll press into things. We don't do that when we become adults. You just think you stop. You don't stop the capacity to learn things. Now, the more you learn, the easier it becomes to learn. So if you're always learning new skills, always learning technology, always learning videos, always paying attention to the algorithms, always paying attention to the analytics, you can keep learning. But if you just stop learning because, well, I graduated school, guess I don't need to learn no more. Yeah, that's bad. So my advice to you guys is build it right the first time. If you didn't build it right the first time, with Rory and Mal, they didn't own anything. And to Joe's point, yeah, he owns everything. It's his podcast. It's literally called the Joe Budden Podcast, okay? And this is why you guys won't see me do something like this with somebody else. Because there's always an imbalance of one person putting in more work than the other person. And then when that one person feels like they should be compensated more because they actually put up the bread, made the investment, the other person feels away. When you do this with your homies, it's not helpful. So my advice to anybody trying to do anything creative, build your own autonomous platform. Start on YouTube. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. You got any desire to get into media, entertainment, rapping, music, start now and build it up. And build it up. And it might be a side hustle. For me, YouTube was just something like a hobby for first 4 or 5 years. And then I touched the algorithm and I was like, oh, okay, there's something here. And because Rory and Mal already have platforms, these dudes could launch a YouTube channel, just them two, shoot over Ecamm Live or over Zoom or over Skype, just shooting a breeze, or do it in person, either or. And it'd be fire because they're interesting to listen to. They did add value to the show, just not enough value where Joe Budden felt like giving them equity and ownership in it. And that's his prerogative. That's his business. He put the bread up. He leveraged his platform. He wrote the contracts. But this whole notion that you have to get an engineer, get a studio, get a hogwash. It's nonsense. It's not. You know how I know it's nonsense? Because there's multiple people doing what Joe Budden has done by themselves. The Meet Kevins, right? The Alan Parrs, the John McCraes. These dudes don't got no engineer and producer and renting out a studio. Guess is in their freaking bedrooms, killing it, crushing it. Meet Kevin grossed $250,000 in the month of May. In 1 month, $250,000 off YouTube AdSense alone. Doing it all himself. old head energy on Joe Budden's part. I love Joe Budden. I love his podcast, but this is some old head energy. This whole like, you got to do it this way. No, they don't. But they do have to be curious. They do have to be willing to learn. They do have to be willing to put in the work. They do have to get out of their comfort zone. And I don't know if Rory and Maul are built like that. I hope they are. And gosh, I hope they see this video, because I'll gift them the course that I just put together just because I want to see them win. And by the way, I don't recommend partnerships. I don't recommend partnerships. I recommend you build your brand and I build my brand, and we collaborate on stuff and we come together on stuff. And if I can leverage my audience to help you build your audience, and I believe in you and you're the homie, respect. And if we do something together, it's a joint venture. It's not a partnership. I'm not trying to start a separate LLC to get like, no, heck no, I don't want that. Like, separate these things. You know what I'm saying? So hopefully that's helpful. Let me know what y'all think.
Kingstream Entertainment. Ruslan.
I saw my mama smile through the silhouette. Sunshine and all. But she don't know that I still feel like we ain't made it yet. No, I ain't lying at